The Great Hall of the Concord of 12 stretched for nearly a mile in every direction. Its ceiling lost somewhere in the artificial clouds that the Silith architects had programmed to drift lazily overhead. And the 12 delegations sat in their assigned sections like gods passing judgment on lesser creatures' ambassador. Keth Voran of the Silith Dominion rose from his hovering throne, his cranial tendrils swaying with what every species in the galaxy recognized as contempt. And he looked down at the small human delegation standing in the petitioner's circle far below. 312 cycles ago, he began, his voice amplified to fill every corner of the hall. We discovered these creatures on a small wet rock at the edge of the spiral arm, and in all that time, they have accomplished nothing worthy of our attention. The Rithkari delegation clicked their mandibles in amusement, and the crystalline Vorkin pulsed with colors that indicated mockery. And even the usually stoic collective allowed their shared consciousness to ripple with something like laughter. Human Ambassador David Chun stood perfectly still in the petitioner's circle, his formal suit looking almost comically plain compared to the flowing robes and bioluminescent garments of the elder races. And he listened to every word without changing his expression. They live 70 rotations, Keth Voran continued, his tendrils now writhing with theatrical disbelief. And they expect us to treat them as equals. But what could they possibly contribute? Since by the time one of them masters basic astrogation, it dies. More laughter echoed through the hall, and Ambassador Chun simply nodded politely, as if he were receiving a compliment rather than an insult. The vote that followed was unanimous, and humanity was granted observer status in the Concord, which meant they could watch but never speak, trade in the margins but never compete, and exist in their 3 allotted systems but never expand beyond them. The human delegation left the hall in silence, and not one of the 12 species noticed the small smile that crossed Ambassador Chun's face as the doors closed behind him back on Earth. That recording played on every screen in every city for 3 days straight, and the people watched Ambassador Keth Voran mock their species, and they watched their own ambassador stand there and take it without a word of protest. And something changed in humanity that day. Director Yuki Tanaka of the United Earth Intelligence Bureau was 42 years old when she first saw that recording, and she made a promise to herself that she would live to see the day when the Concord would regret every single word. She framed a transcript of Keth Voran's speech and hung it above her desk, and beneath it she wrote a single note in her own handwriting that simply said, "Let them laugh." For the next 50 years. Director Tanaka built the most sophisticated intelligence network the galaxy had ever seen, though no one in the galaxy knew it existed, because humans were too primitive and short-lived to pose any threat. The Concord had rules, and those rules were very clear about what humanity could and could not do. And on the surface, humanity followed every single one of them without complaint. They were forbidden from building warships larger than frigate class, so they built exactly 0 ships larger than frigate class. And the Concord inspectors who occasionally bothered to check found nothing suspicious at all. They were forbidden from colonizing beyond their 3 assigned systems, so their official records showed populations only in those 3 systems. And the Concord never thought to look any deeper than official records. They were forbidden from developing weapons above a certain power level, so every weapon they showed to the Concord fell exactly within the permitted limits. And the inspectors went home satisfied that humans were following the rules. What the Concord never understood was that humanity had learned a very important lesson from their first contact with the elder races. And that lesson was simple. The powerful do not watch the weak. The Silith had faster-than-light communication networks that spanned the entire galaxy, and they used encryption methods that had remained unchanged for 10,000 years, because no species had ever dared to intercept Silith communications. and no species had ever possessed the ability to break their codes. Humanity broke those codes in the first 50 years. The Rithkari hegemony maintained detailed records of every military vessel in their fleet, including deployment schedules and maintenance rotations and even the personal habits of individual commanders. And they stored all of this information on networks that were connected to the greater galactic web. Because why would they worry about security when they were the most powerful military force in the sector? Humanity downloaded those records completely. Within the first century, the Vorcan Collective believed that their crystalline neural networks made them immune to infiltration, since no organic being could possibly interface with their silicon-based thought patterns. But they never considered that humanity might simply build machines that could. And by the second century, humanity knew every secret the collective had ever tried to hide. Director Tanaka retired at the age of 92, having spent half a century building something that the Concorde could never imagine. And her successor continued her work, and her successor continued after that. Because humans might live short lives, but they have learned to pass their knowledge down through generations like a sacred flame. Ambassador Chen had died long before Tanaka retired, but his granddaughter now held his position, and she attended every Concorde session with the same polite silence, the same patient expression, the same willingness to accept whatever insults the elder races chose to deliver. The galaxy continued to turn, and the Concorde continued to squabble among themselves over territory and trade and ancient grudges that predated human existence by millennia. And they continued to ignore the small primitive species living at the edge of the spiral arm. 300 years after that first humiliating session, Director Yuki Tanaka's great-great-granddaughter sat in the same office, looking at the same framed transcript, reading the same handwritten note. Her name was Mei Tanaka, and she had just received word that the Concorde had recalled their observerships from human space, because they needed every vessel they could spare for yet another pointless war between the Silith and the Rithkari. She picked up her communicator and sent a single coded message to 17 different locations scattered across the galaxy. And that message contained only 2 words: begin preparations, somewhere in the deep black between stars. Shipyards that did not officially exist began to wake from their long slumber, and factories that had been built in secret over centuries started their engines for the first time. And humanity prepared to show the galaxy exactly what 300 years of patience could accomplish. The Concorde had laughed at humanity for 3 centuries. They would not be laughing much longer. Deep beneath the red stone of Olympus monks, in tunnels that had been carved by machines designed to leave no trace, Admiral Chen Weilin studied the holographic display that filled the command center. And what he saw made him smile. The display showed the entire Orion Spur, with every Concorde fleet marked in red and every human asset marked in blue. And the blue marks outnumbered the red by a factor of 3 to 1. Though the Concorde had absolutely no idea that most of those blue marks existed. The Silith have committed 80% of their combat fleet to the border with Rithkari space, reported Commander Sarah Okonkwo, her dark eyes reflecting the glow of the tactical display. And the Rithkari have matched them ship for ship, which means both of their core territories are defended by skeleton crews. Admiral Chen nodded slowly, his weathered face showing none of the excitement that burned in his chest, because he had waited his entire life for this moment. And his mother had waited before him, and her father had waited before her, stretching back through generations to that first humiliating day in the Concorde Hall. "What about the Vorcan?" he asked, his voice calm and measured. "The collective has withdrawn into their usual isolation, and they believe this conflict does not concern them," which is exactly what we expected them to believe. And the others? Commander Okonkwo pulled up another display showing the remaining 9 species of the Concorde. each with their own territorial boundaries and fleet deployments clearly marked. And Chun studied each one carefully before speaking again. "They are distracted," she said, "and they are weak. And they are completely unaware that anything is about to change." Chun turned away from the display and walked to the observation window that looked out over the vast underground chamber below, where thousands of workers moved between rows of ships that the galaxy did not know existed. And he thought about his great-grandmother, who had stood in the petitioner's circle so long ago. She had taught him that anger was a tool like any other, and that the secret to using it effectively was patience, and that the species who could master both anger and patience would eventually master everything else as well. "Tell me about the technical preparations," he said without turning around. "The infiltration protocols are ready," Okonkwo replied. "And we have confirmed access to 94% of Concord military vessels, including their flagship systems. And our people have tested the kill codes on isolated targets with 100% success. The kill codes were humanity's greatest achievement and their most closely guarded secret. And they had taken nearly 2 centuries to develop, because breaking into alien systems was only the first step. And the real challenge was figuring out how to make those systems do exactly what you wanted them to do." Every Concord warship ran on standardized technology that had remained essentially unchanged for millennia, because the elder races saw no need to innovate when their current systems worked perfectly well. And this standardization had made them vulnerable in ways they never imagined. Human engineers had studied those systems with obsessive attention, mapping every circuit and analyzing every line of code. And they had found weaknesses that the original designers never knew existed. And they had built tools to exploit those weaknesses with surgical precision. "The frigate swarms?" Chan asked, still gazing at the ships below. 12,000 vessels ready to deploy, each one capable of operating independently or as part of a networked whole. And the eye coordination systems have been tested extensively in the deep colonies. The Concord had forbidden humanity from building large warships. So humanity had built small ones instead, but they had built them by the thousands. And they had designed them to fight together as a single organism with 12,000 bodies. Each frigate was fast and agile and expendable. But when they operated together, they became something far more dangerous, because they could swarm around larger vessels and attack from every direction at once. And their distributed intelligence meant that destroying one ship simply made the others fight harder. "What about the information packages?" Chan asked. Finally turning back to face his commander, Okonkwo smiled. And it was not a pleasant smile. "Ready for distribution. And we have compiled 300 years of surveillance data into formats that each species will find personally devastating, including financial records and communication, logs and evidence of every betrayal and corruption and lie that the Concord has ever tried to hide." The elder races believed that their secrets were safe, because they trusted each other not to spy, and they trusted their security systems to catch anyone who tried. But they had never considered that the small primitive humans might have been watching everything from the very beginning, and our people on the inside. Chun asked, "In position at every major installation, and they are ready to act on your command." This was perhaps humanity's most remarkable achievement, because over 3 centuries, humans had spread throughout Concord space in roles that no one considered important. And they had become servants and laborers and entertainers and translators. And they had watched and listened and learned while hiding in plain sight. The elder races never suspected their servants of espionage, because to them, humans were barely sentient creatures with laughably short lifespans. And the idea that these primitives might be dangerous was simply too absurd to consider. Chun thought about all the human agents scattered across the galaxy, each one carrying secrets that could bring down empires, each one waiting for the signal that would change everything. And he felt a profound gratitude for their sacrifice and their patience. "One more question," he said quietly, "and I want you to answer honestly." "Of course." "Admiral, are we ready to do this without firing a single shot?" Okonkwo considered the question carefully before responding, because she understood what the Admiral was really asking. And she understood that the answer mattered more than anything else they had discussed. "Yes," she said finally. "We can bring them to their knees without killing anyone. But only if everything goes according to plan. And only if they choose to surrender rather than fight. And if they choose to fight, then we will defend ourselves. But our first priority has always been to demonstrate our capabilities rather than to use them destructively." Chun nodded, satisfied with her answer, because humanity had spent 3 centuries planning this moment. And they had always intended to prove their strength through restraint rather than through violence. The Concord expected primitives to attack with brute force, because that was what primitives did. But humanity had evolved beyond such simple thinking. And they understood that true power came from the ability to destroy without actually destroying. "Send the signal to all stations," Chun said, his voice steady and calm, "and inform them that Phase 1 begins in 72 hours. Okonkwo saluted and turned to carry out his orders. And Chun returned his gaze to the observation window, watching the ships that would soon reshape the galaxy. 300 years of patience had led to this moment. And humanity was finally ready to show the Concord what they had become. The laughingstock of the spiral arm was about to stop laughing and start speaking. Thessaly Station hung in the darkness between stars, a modest trading post on the edge of human space. And it was here that the galaxy first learned to fear the species it had mocked for 3 centuries. Station Administrator Margaret Cole stood at the main viewport of her office, watching the approaching lights of the Silith diplomatic vessel, and her weathered face betrayed no emotion as she counted the escort cruisers that accompanied it. 2 warships, each one capable of reducing Thessaly Station to scattered atoms with a single volley. And Ambassador Kethvorin himself was on board, coming to deliver new trade restrictions that would strangle human commerce even further. Margaret was 73 years old, and she had spent her entire life preparing for this day, though no one on the station knew about her true role. And no one suspected this quiet administrator was about to deliver a message that would shake the foundations of galactic civilization. "The ambassador's shuttle is requesting docking clearance," reported her assistant from the doorway. "Granted," Margaret replied without turning around. "And prepare the conference room for our guests." She allowed herself a small smile as the shuttle detached from the diplomatic vessel and began its approach, because the ambassador had no idea what was waiting for him, and neither did the crews of those 2 magnificent warships. Ambassador Kethvorin swept into the conference room with all the arrogance that his species was famous for, his cranial tendrils swaying in patterns that communicated contempt and superiority to anyone who could read them. And his entourage spread out behind him like a wave of silk and authority. Margaret greeted him with a respectful bow, exactly as protocol demanded, and she listened patiently as he delivered his pronouncements about new tariffs and additional restrictions and the general disappointment that the Concord felt regarding human economic growth. "The Concord has determined that your species has been exceeding your designated development parameters," Kethvorin declared, his voice dripping with condescension. "And these new measures are designed to return you to your proper place in the galactic order." "I understand completely," Margaret replied, her tone perfectly neutral. "And Earth will, of course, comply with whatever the Concord decides." Kethvorin seemed almost disappointed by her easy acceptance, because part of him had been hoping for some primitive display of defiance that he could mock later at diplomatic functions. But the human administrator simply stood there with her hands folded, waiting for him to continue. "You will sign these documents acknowledging the new restrictions," he said, sliding a datapad across the table. "Of course." Margaret agreed. "But first, I wonder if I might ask you to look out the viewport." The ambassador frowned, his tendrils twitching with irritation at this unexpected request, but he turned to follow her gesture. And what he saw made his entire body go rigid. His escort cruisers were dark, not destroyed, not damaged, simply dark, and they drifted in the void like dead things. Their running lights extinguished and their engines cold and their weapons silent. "What is the meaning of this?" Kethvaran demanded, his voice rising with something that sounded almost like fear. "Your ships experienced a simultaneous systems failure," Margaret explained calmly, as if she were discussing the weather, "and their life support, propulsion, weapons, and communications have all been disabled, though our engineers have already begun providing emergency assistance to ensure no lives are lost." The ambassador stared at her with an expression that no human had ever seen on a Silith face before. And Margaret realized with quiet satisfaction that she was looking at genuine terror. "This is an act of war," he said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "No, Ambassador, this is a demonstration," Margaret replied, and she allowed the mask of humble compliance to fall away at last, revealing something cold and patient underneath. "And we have been studying your technology for 300 years, learning every system and mapping every weakness and developing tools that can turn your own ships against you without firing a single shot." She placed a data chip on the table between them, and the ambassador stared at it as if it were a venomous creature. "That contains our terms," Margaret continued, "including full membership in the Concord, immediate removal of all restrictions on human development, and recognition of our territorial claims to the 17 star systems we have been quietly colonizing for the past century. The Concord will never accept these demands," Kethvaran said, though his voice trembled as he spoke. "The Concord will receive identical demonstrations at 14 other stations within the hour," Margaret informed him, "along with evidence that we have had access to your defense grid for decades. And they will learn that we could have shut down their entire civilization at any point during the past 50 years. She leaned forward, and her eyes were hard as stone. "We chose not to, Ambassador, and I want you to remember that when you deliver our message, because humanity has always had the power to destroy you, and humanity has always chosen restraint instead." Kethvaran reached for his communication device, but Margaret shook her head. "Your personal communicator has also been disabled, but we will allow you to use our communication systems to contact your government. And we want them to hear directly from you what has happened here today." The ambassador stood frozen for a long moment, and Margaret could see his mind racing as he processed the implications of what she had told him, and she knew that he was finally understanding just how badly the Concord had underestimated humanity. "Why now?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because you gave us 300 years to prepare," Margaret replied, "and because you were so certain of your superiority that you never bothered to watch us, and because every restriction you placed on us only made us more creative, and every insult you delivered only made us more determined." She gestured toward the communication console. "Make your call, Ambassador, and tell the Concord that Earth is ready to speak, and tell them that they would be very wise to listen." Kethvaran moved toward the console like a sleepwalker, and as Margaret watched him go, she thought about all the generations of humans who had lived and died while building toward this moment, and she whispered a quiet thank you to every single one of them. The demonstration at Thessaly Station was only the beginning. And across the galaxy, similar scenes were playing out at 14 other locations. And the Concord was about to learn that the species they had dismissed as primitives had become something far more dangerous than they ever imagined. Humanity was finally speaking, and the galaxy would never be the same. The emergency session of the Concord of 12 began with shouting and ended with silence. And what happened between those two moments would be studied by historians for centuries to come. Ambassador Keth Voran stood before his fellow delegates, his normally proud posture slumped with exhaustion and fear, and he delivered his report about Thessaly, stationed while the representatives of 11 other species listened with expressions ranging from disbelief to horror. They disabled both cruisers simultaneously, he said, his tendrils hanging limp and defeated, and they did it without any visible weapon, without any warning, and without killing a single crew member. And they told me they could have done the same thing to every ship in our fleet. The Rithkari High Commander slammed his armored fist against his podium, and the sound echoed through the chamber like a thunderclap. Then we destroy them, he declared, his mandibles clicking with aggressive fury. And we send every available warship to human space, and we burn their worlds to ash. And we show them what happens to species who dare to threaten the Concorde. With what ships? Asked the Vorcan representative, their crystalline form flickering with agitated colors. Because we have received reports that human agents have demonstrated the same capability at 14 additional locations, including 2 installations in Rithkari space. The High Commander fell silent. And for the first time in recorded history, the Concorde chamber was filled with fear rather than arrogance. Director Mai Tanaka watched the session from her command center beneath Olympus Mons, because humanity had been monitoring Concorde communications for centuries, and she knew exactly what was being said in that chamber before the delegates themselves had finished saying it. Begin Phase 2, she ordered, and her staff immediately set to work on the next stage of the plan. Phase 2 was not about military force or technological demonstrations, and it was far more devastating than anything the Concorde had experienced so far, because Phase 2 was about the truth. For 300 years, humanity had watched the elder races, and they had recorded everything, and they had compiled a database of secrets that could destroy every alliance and shatter every relationship that held the Concorde together. The Silith delegation suddenly found their private communication channels flooded with evidence that the Rithkari had been funding terrorist groups in their colonial territories for the past 5 centuries. And the evidence was undeniable. And it included financial records and communication logs and even video recordings of secret meetings the Rithkari received. Similar packages showing that the Silith had been manipulating their currency markets to keep the hegemony economically dependent. And the scale of the fraud was so massive that it explained 300 years of economic struggles that the Rithkari had always blamed on their own incompetence. The Vorcan collective learned that 4 of the other Concorde species had been secretly developing weapons specifically designed to destroy crystalline life forms, and the research files included detailed plans for genocide that the collective had never suspected. Every species received evidence of betrayals by their allies, and every species saw proof that the friendships they had relied upon were built on lies. And within hours, the Concorde was tearing itself apart. Director Tanaka watched the chaos unfold with grim satisfaction, because this was exactly what humanity had planned. And this was the price that the elder races would pay for 3 centuries of arrogance. The Silith ambassador has officially accused the Rithkari of acts of war, reported one of her analysts, and the Rithkari High Commander has demanded the execution of Silith intelligence agents. And the Vorcan have sealed their borders and recalled all diplomatic personnel. What about the others? Tanaka asked. The remaining 9 species are all scrambling to assess the damage, and most of them are discovering that their closest allies have been working against them for centuries. The information that humanity had released was all true, which was the most devastating part of the attack, because the elder races could not dismiss it as propaganda or fabrication. When they could verify every detail through their own records, they had done these things to each other. And humanity had simply shown them the evidence. Admiral Chun Wei-lin joined Director Tanaka in the command center. And together, they watched the Concord session descend into accusations and threats and counter-threats that would have been unthinkable just hours before. They are breaking apart faster than we projected. Chun observed, feared as that. Tanaka replied, and they have spent so long believing themselves invulnerable that they have no idea how to respond to a genuine threat. Are we ready for Phase 3? Tanaka nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving the displays that showed the chaos spreading across the galaxy. The fleet is in position, and the broadcast systems are ready, and President Osei has been briefed on her role. Then let us finish what our ancestors started. Chun turned to the communication officer and gave the order that would change the galaxy forever. Open a channel to every inhabited world in the Orion Spur and inform President Osei that Earth is ready to speak. The communication officer's hands trembled slightly as she entered the commands, because she understood the weight of this moment, and she understood that nothing would ever be the same after the next few minutes. Channel open. Admiral, transmit across the galaxy. On 1,000 worlds and 1,000,000 stations and aboard countless ships, screens flickered and changed, and the face of humanity's leader appeared before species who had spent 3 centuries laughing at her kind. President Amara Osei looked into the camera with eyes that held no fear and no anger, only the quiet confidence of a species that had finally finished preparing for this moment, and humanity began to speak. President Amara Osei stood in the broadcast chamber deep beneath the African continent, surrounded by the humming machinery that would carry her voice to every corner of the galaxy. And she took a moment to think about everyone who had sacrificed to make this moment possible. Her grandmother had been a spy in Scylla space, living her entire life in disguise so that she could send information back to Earth. And she had died without ever seeing her homeworld again. Her father had worked in the secret shipyards beyond the quarantine line, building vessels that would never be acknowledged, knowing that he might not live to see them fly, and countless others had given everything they had to a dream that most of them would never see fulfilled. Because humans died young, but humans also knew how to pass their hopes from generation to generation. Like a flame that could never be extinguished, the broadcast light turned green, and President Osei began to speak. For 300 years, she said, her voice carrying to every world in the Orion Spur. You called us children, and you confined us to a corner of the galaxy, and you told us we were too primitive and too short-lived to matter on Sylph Prime. Citizens stopped in the streets to stare at public screens, and the normally bustling capital fell silent as the human leader spoke. You mocked our ambassador when he asked for equal treatment, and you laughed at our requests, and you assumed that because we die young, we must think small. In the Rithkari war rooms, military commanders watched the broadcast with growing unease, because they had just discovered that their entire fleet could be disabled at any moment, and they were only now beginning to understand how badly they had underestimated humanity. You were wrong, President Osei continued, and your greatest mistake was believing that short lives meant small ambitions, when the truth is exactly the opposite. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of 3 centuries of patience and determination. Because we die young, we do not have the luxury of waiting, and because we die young, we learn to work together across generations, and because we die young, we understand that every moment matters and every opportunity must be seized. The Vorkan Collective, watching through their crystalline neural networks, processed her words with growing alarm, because they had always believed that longevity was the key to wisdom. And this human was showing them a different kind of strength. You gave us 300 years to prepare, and we used every single day of those years. And while you were distracted by your eternal wars and your ancient grudges, we were watching and learning and building something you never imagined possible on Earth. Billions of humans watched their president speak, and many of them wept, because they had grown up hearing stories about the mockery their ancestors had endured. And they had grown up believing that someday humanity would have its answer. We have demonstrated our capabilities, and you have seen what we can do to your ships and your networks and your carefully guarded secrets. But I want you to understand something very important. President Osei leaned forward, and her eyes seemed to look directly at every viewer across the galaxy. Everything we have done so far has been a demonstration of restraint. And we could have crashed your economies and collapsed your governments and turned your own weapons against you. But we chose not to. She let those words sink in before continuing, because we remember what it felt like to be powerless. And we remember what it felt like to be mocked and dismissed and treated as something less than worthy. And we do not wish that feeling on anyone. The broadcast fell silent for a moment, and across the galaxy, species who had spent 3 centuries laughing at humanity waited to hear what would come next. The Concord of 12 is finished, President Osei declared, and the ancient order that treated some species as masters and others as servants is over. And in its place we propose something new. We call it the Assembly of Equals. And it is exactly what the name suggests, because every species will have one voice. And every world will have representation, and no one will ever again be told that they are too primitive or too short-lived to matter. Admiral Chun watched the broadcast from his command center, and he felt tears forming in his eyes because he had dedicated his entire life to this moment. And his mother had done the same, and her father before her. Stretching back through 8 generations of Chen family service, you can join us in building something better, President Osei continued. And you can help us create a galaxy where strength is measured by cooperation rather than conquest, and where wisdom is judged by actions rather than age. She paused one final time, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a warning that no one in the galaxy would ever forget. Or you can try to stop us. And you can learn what humanity is truly capable of when we stop holding back. But I do not recommend this path. We are not asking for a seat at your table anymore, because we are building a new table, and the only question that remains is whether you will be sitting at it as partners, or watching from the outside as we reshape the galaxy without you. The broadcast ended, and silence fell across 1,000 worlds within hours. The first responses began to arrive, and they were not what humanity expected, because instead of threats and defiance, the elder races sent diplomats and negotiators and requests for clarification. The Concord had ruled the galaxy through fear for 10,000 years. But humanity had shown them something more powerful than fear. And that was the possibility of something better. Ambassador HFY was the first elder race representative to arrive on Earth. And he came not with demands or threats, but with a formal apology and a request to discuss terms. Director Tanaka met him personally at the landing pad, and she looked at the being who had once mocked her species with such contempt, and she saw something in his eyes that she had never expected to see. Respect. I have a message from the Silith Dominion, HFY said, his tendrils hanging low in a gesture of humility. And we would like to discuss membership in your Assembly of Equals. Tanaka nodded slowly, and she thought about her great-great-grandmother, who had first hung that transcript above her desk. And she thought about all the generations who had worked and sacrificed and died to reach this moment. Welcome to Earth, Ambassador, she said finally, and let us begin building something new together. The galaxy had laughed at humanity for 300 years, and humanity had smiled and waited and prepared, and now the laughter had stopped, and the real work could finally begin.